Hello, and on today's episode of the 411 from Highway 441, I will be discussing cultural immersion. First and foremost, what is immersion? Immersion is being totally surrounded by something, as in I was immersed in the pool. So if you were underwater at the pool, you'd be completely surrounded by the water and you would be immersed. When we talk about culture, we are most familiar with the American culture. It is our own. We should have a passing familiarity with many different cultures that we come across here in America as a melting pot. But to have cultural immersion, you need to exist and be totally surrounded by a culture other than yourself. The best way to accomplish this, obviously, is travel. So I thought that I would share some of my travel experiences with you all in an effort to discuss cultural immersion and some of my takeaways. First, let me talk about Nicaragua. I went a few years on mission trips to Nicaragua, that is South America. And we were working in the village of Chinandega, helping to rebuild from this mudslide which had devastated the village that we were helping to rebuild. The people there had been, the survivors of the mudslide, it was pretty tragic stuff, had been at a local dump. They had to hike miles to go to this dump site. And they were all wading through trash and trying to clean up little knickknacks so that they could walk another 10 miles or so to the nearest marketplace and try to sell these trinkets to get enough money to buy food and such. Also, this country, this nation was, and I believe still is, in the grips of civil war. There are guerrillas in the mountains in that area that are rebels against the government of that nation, and there are regular incidences where violence occurs, and I remember it was the first time, culturally speaking, that I had seen a military-style weapon being wielded and casually displayed by general population. So we get off the airport. I remember there were gun turrets on the landing pad as we were landing, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. That's got to be a throwback, when they were at wartime, and these were here to protect the strip so that they could land. And I thought that was cool, but it didn't shock me very much. And then I got into the airport, and there were military garb individuals walking around with some semi-automatic weapons, and even that I was like, okay, all right, this is obviously they want to protect the tourists coming in and out of this port, and I feel as though they're here for my safety and I don't feel threatened by them. And then we get onto the buses, and we're going to the area where we are going to stay. And as we're driving and I'm soaking in the surroundings, I remember several things. I remember there were lots of stray animals, and it was very sad, all these emaciated dogs and cats just wandering around. I remember it was the first time I had ever seen a street vendor selling drinks in plastic bags. She just poured it from pitchers into these plastic bags, tied it off with a straw going down the tie, and people would just kind of hold the bags and drink from the little plastic bags. And then back to the big shocker, I saw a bunch of people just walking around with weapons. And I was asking our mission leader about that, and he was telling us about the struggles between the people and the government, and that the area we are staying should be safe, and they'd hired on armed guards that were not going to be posted right at our area, but were patrolling our street, and and that the people holding these weapons was not uncommon. I said, well, man, that wouldn't happen in America. I think that the military or the police would not just want people walking around with automatic rifles at any point, feeling like they have the capacity to kill somebody. And it's really interesting because that was about a decade ago, and where we are now, just recently downtown Atlanta, I was having a lunch with some of my family. We had gone to, I think it's Joe's on Juniper, which is a restaurant that is strongly associated with the LGBTQ community. It had a porch, and we brought our dogs so we could have brunch with my mother and my brother and his girlfriend, and me and my wife and my daughter and our 2 puppies. And suddenly there were armed, militant-looking protesters that walked by. I saw about a dozen African Americans holding protest signs. I was unfamiliar at the time. I had to research. They were protesting against this individual who was being held for violent assault charges, and they were trying to get him free. And the way they were going about doing this, they dressed up in total black and were walking with AKs downtown Atlanta. And it made me think back to, wow, this is not as uncommon as it used to be. Weapons prevalent in our society, our general society, and that was interesting. I'm going on 7 minutes. I'll share one more cultural immersion story. Let me go now to South Korea. My wife and I taught in South Korea for almost 2 years. It was a fantastic experience, and I was able to truly observe and immerse myself for a very extended amount of time in a culture other than my own. There are a couple of things that come immediately to mind that I can share with you. Sexuality and the physical display of affection. I remember it was rather jarring when I was first walking around the schools and observing the students that I was going to be teaching. There were lots of little young boys that were holding hands going up and down the hallways. And then in the classrooms, these little boys would sit next to one another, and they would have their hands on one another's legs, on their knee or the part of the thigh, and it just struck me as odd, and I had to ask somebody about it, and they explained to me that culturally speaking in Korea, it is not uncommon for non-sexual physical contact to be shared between friends, which is buddies, guys or girls, and it is just part of how they are raised. It's part of what they get imprinted with. It's not uncommon. It's just the status quo of that level of their society, and I had to get used to that because I found it very distracting at first, and I had to recognize that these were just friends. And in America, I suppose our equivalent would be, I do see a lot of masculine peacocking, and high school boys seem to share physical contact through a more violent approach, whether it's fist bumping or checking each other or all the little slapping and punching and kicking and silly boy things that we do here in America. That was very interesting. Again, back to the sexuality and cultural differences. I remember the first time I went to a jjimjilbang, which is a bathhouse. I remember learning about bathhouses in social studies and history classes, and it was in the Roman times. They had these bathhouses where everyone would get together, and although I thought that was weird and everyone snickered a bit, it kind of made sense that before we had access to plumbing and clean water sources, and if you spent a buttload of time building, back in the day, these large pools and then filling them with clean filtered water and then nice flowers and aromas and oils and junk. You would be able to make yourself a nice little bit of profit. That would be a good business, because I don't think it's something that a general population would have access to, and that would be a prestige business, and you could probably bank. So I was like, okay, and it makes sense that these things existed. And then when I got to Korea, I saw that those operations were everywhere. There were these bathhouses. Every major city and town had their own jjimjilbang. And when you go in, there's a front counter, and the men will go off to the left and the women will go off to the right through these different locations, gender separated, and you check in your things, and they give you a towel. Then you go into the locker room and you strip to the nude, and then you go into the bathhouses. So I was trying to fit in and be open to this experience, and I was able to go in initially with the towel, and then it was just interesting seeing that the nudity that was displayed, because none of them were wearing towels, all the Koreans that were in the jjimjilbang. And at first, again, it was this huge shock to me, and it was very uncomfortable, something that I hadn't been, had to deal with since I was in football camps back in the day, and you had, the open showers at the high school. But I went in with an extreme defensiveness and insecurity from my own social programming. As an American, I was much larger than them, both height, build, as well as weight. I was overweight and still am, but it was interesting throughout that experiencing. There were families there, like an uncle and a father and kids, and the kids are running around chasing each other, and they have all these different baths. There's like an ice bath and a jasmine bath, and then there's like these different temperature ones. One's like what you would consider spa temperature, which I would say is pretty hot, and then they have like the extreme, which is the one that feels like it's going to burn your skin off. And then also everyone that I went with told me that I had to get a body scrub, which is part of this health regimen that all of these jjimjilbangs offered. So I put the money down, and they got smiles on their face, and I don't quite get it. And I go with this Korean guy, and he's got like a massage table. He asked me to lie down. So I'm kind of going with it with an eyebrow up, like, what did I get myself into? And he pulls out these like mitts, and they look kind of like soapstones, I guess. It's kind of like loofah, but hard, and then proceeds to like completely remove the top layer of skin from nearly the entire surface of my body. It was extremely painful, and definitely broke my personal space bubble. I did it once for that experience, but would not do that again. However, it was certainly an interesting feeling after that. Going from the cold to the hot, and then getting the full scrub down and coming out, I felt the most clean I think I ever have felt in my entire life. So those are some cultural immersion experiences that I have picked up along the way, and I thought that it would be relevant as we approach our own culture and how levels of culture can impact one another if we are open to sharing experiences and trying to understand the true nature of the world, and not just live inside a box where we think we know all there is to know about others and the differences between us. The overarching thing that I've gained from all of my travels is that as human beings, we have legitimately much more in common with one another than we have different. Everywhere I went, and all the things I saw, and all the people that I interacted with, and many of whom there were huge language barriers, and I could not use my communication skills It was just very, very interesting to me to absorb all of that and recognize how people are generally the same, and our traditions and our cultures may be different, but we all want respect. We all want to be treated well. We all want to be surrounded by love and encouragement. And I truly believe in our hearts, we all want to be good people. So I hope you have a wonderful day. This has been another episode of the 411 from Highway 441.